Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Meta and Apex Legends Competitive Podcast. I'm your host, Burke, and today joining me is the coach for Not Moist, formerly Moist Esports, Draugr. And today we are discussing end zones, how to predict them, the ways that zone reading impacts the value of POIs, and how to use these tools to give your team the best chance at success, whether you're in Pro League, Challenger Circuit, or just looking to improve in ranked. Then at the end, we'll discuss a little bit about the current Moist roster and what we can expect from them going into the end of Pro League and future lands. So, Draugr, thank you for joining me today.
No worries at all, mate. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you
Mm.
doing this intro again because I literally just realized I wasn't recording for the first 2 minutes.
No
So,
worries. That's fine.
but yeah. So, Draugr, you've been a part of the esport for a while and been a big part of the success of Moist, both formerly in Apex South and now over in North America. And you got second place in last split. You got fourth place at Split One playoffs, which is a huge feat for a team that struggled with a lot of external issues and with not getting visas and having to scrim out of Canada as well as Portugal, and unfortunately having to part ways with Moist going into land because of those issues. And obviously, more has happened to the team since I'm sure people are interested to hear about the current roster and the expectations for them. But before we get into any of that, can you dive into how you got started into coaching and eventually onto the Moist roster?
Yeah, so I back at the start of last year was a pro league player in Apex South. And yeah, genuinely my team was very very mediocre to put it nicely, I guess. And yeah, I was close friends with a couple of the boys on the Moist roster at the time, back when it was Waltzy Pricey Empty. And they kind of told me that they were having communication and chemistry issues. Um, and I guess my only background in coaching was not esports related at all. It was basketball. Um, but yeah, I went. I paid for my own ticket to Split One playoffs in London, and pretty much just you know offered to boot camp with them, and I guess try and mediate their discussions and help with their communication and chemistry issues with honestly no intention of stepping into like a permanent coach role. And then yeah, I don't know, it just kind of went really well from there, to be honest with you. Just felt like everything clicked pretty quickly. They had a top six at LAN, which was their best LAN result yet. Um, um, yeah, and then they asked me to join on after that, and it was a pretty easy decision getting to work with players like that
Right.
at an organization like Moist.
So, I mean, I think in esports and Apex in general, for a long time, there's been a question of what that role of a coach is on a professional Apex team, and like obviously we know now that a coach plays a vital role in the team, and but I think for many they still don't really know what that role is exactly. It is undeniable that you've obviously helped this team tremendously, but could you go into a little bit of what specifically you do for the team and how you contribute to their success as a roster?
Yeah, so ultimately, a coach's most beneficial asset, I guess, is quite simply put, like mediation. A lot of the times, top tier players with, you know, egos, to be quite frank, are going to disagree with each other when they've, got two opposing opinions. Um, and lots of emotions flying, and it's just so much easier for an impartial point of view to point out like what the biggest mistakes were, or what we want to do differently next time, what the better game plan might have been, when they have zero bias towards anything that's happened in the game. Like, they don't care who's right, who's wrong. It's going to be completely impartial. So I think that already helps with team chemistry, helps with um, having productive end of game conversations, and just kind of makes almost every aspect of the game run just that little bit smoother. It's also taking a massive load off the shoulders of an IGL for the most part. So in most team dynamics, the IGL does a lot of the prep work, um, whether it be something as small as like a loot path to as big as planning your macro to every possible zone there is. But then it's, as soon as you've got a coach in your team, you've got kind of someone you can bounce ideas off of. An IGL and a coach is often going to work very closely together. Um, so yeah, it's kind of like really just a coach really just bolsters team chemistry, um, makes end of game discussions or VOD reviews so much more productive, and in some cases makes them happen.
Right.
And then yeah, it's just a massive takes a massive load off of the IGL's shoulders in most cases.
Yeah, I imagine it's like a pretty massive role because I mean, like you said, taking it off the IGL shoulders. I think for a team that doesn't have a coach, the common consensus is that like the IGL is putting in most of the work for everything outside of game, and the other two players kind of show up. And I feel like as much as that shouldn't be the case, I think that happens a lot. More than people would like to admit. And I think a coach, like you said, for one, you bring the players to the table to do their parts, and then you also take a lot off of them so that they can focus on the things that they have within their control, and the things within their level of expertise. So I mean, that's definitely a hard job that I think coaches definitely don't receive that level of credit yet in the esport. And I think maybe people are starting to come around to that, which is awesome to see, but definitely still a work in progress. And one of the things that was a big thing that I know I started seeing from you was and you talked a little bit about helping with like loot pathing and rotations and a lot of the macro for a team. And it's especially true when all of these things are constantly changing, and there's a lot of information that is involved around the map that makes it hard for you to figure out exactly kind of what's going on, especially where like end zones are going to pull. And so I wanted to spend some time today talking about how to kind of figure out how end zones work, and where they pull, and how you can figure that out in a game. And specifically because one of the tweets that maybe originally think and ask you to come on, the original topic that I was thinking of talking about was during the invalid zone changes that happened. I want to say, was that the end of split one or the beginning of this split? I want to say it was the end of split one that it
And
was.
this split one, I'm pretty sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it was during that time that you had kind of were the first person that brought it to people's attention that these invalid zones have changed, and the implications that had over the overall ends of the rings. And since then, even more changes have been made to the way that end zones can pool. But I think it's more important to dive into the invalid zone first because they're an important pretext to zone reading, like as a whole. Could you briefly explain what invalid zones are, the changes that happened during that time, and why invalid zones are so important for teams to understand and be aware of, if you think they
Yeah,
are
so
important?
initially, invalid zones are brought in to, you know, widely stop pretty much, any possible end zone that's going to be or lack competitiveness. So any that, where the majority of the zone is a mountain or a non-playable area or out of bounds. Um, Something Apex implemented quite a while ago was removing zones on multi-layered buildings so that, it was
Right.
impossible for a zone to finish in a heal off. Um, they When Storm Point first arrived, there were a fair few zones that finished out in open water. They removed those and made any open zones like that invalid. And yeah, it was genuinely just to make each end zone as competitive as they possibly could.
Yeah, and I think like that's a big thing is like when that change occurred, there's understanding where these invalid zones are is really important because like you said, if you know that a multi-layered building is not going to be the end where the end pulls because because there's going to be a heal off or something, it's not competitively viable, then obviously you can plan around that and realize, well, maybe then playing out of that in some situations isn't the winning strategy because I'm not in a spot where the zone could possibly end, and it can help you kind of narrow down what's going to be valid or not. And correct me if I'm mistaken, it those changes specifically then were kind of undoing some of that, correct? Like it actually undid some of those zones that normally would have been less competitively viable, or was it the opposite way around?
No, it definitely did make it tricky for a little bit. So to be honest with you, the reason that I think in my tweet that you mentioned earlier, I said that I implied that it was unintentional and must have been a bug or a mistake. because it didn't make sense at the time. You know, these changes were brought in and these invalid zones were implemented to make sure that every end zone, you know, has as much competitiveness or as high of a level of competitiveness to it as possible. Um, and then, yeah, I guess as soon as we started seeing zones pull out into open water again, or
Yeah.
you know, open fields, and they were completely new zones, and then zones that were really popular, the one that brought it to mine and empty's attention initially was most devastated zones would pull to the very far south buildings,
Yep.
whereas all of a sudden, and the 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 area just below the prowler nest out to the east of Launchpad
Yep.
was an invalid zone, and all of a sudden we saw a zone pull there. And we're like, that was odd. And then for the next, I think, week, every time we thought it was going to finish south of devastated in the buildings that it usually pulls to, it would pull out to this, you know, old invalid zone area. So we were like, what's going on here? We started having a look at a couple of the zones that had pulled up that had popped up recently, and realized, yep, no, 100% invalid zones aren't working anymore. I spoke to um, AOGS admins and EA devs, and yeah, it was confirmed to me that the change was deliberate. So it was very confusing
Yeah.
at the time, and it was hard to kind of understand why they'd bring in a change like that.
Yeah, because I think like I guess from like a a pub's perspective or like a entertainment perspective for like the casual player, maybe having some of those weird zones could be an enjoyment factor for them or something. But definitely from a competitive environment, it opens a lot of doors that now have to be considered, and I think that's something that I mean, like you said, unless you're keeping an eye on it, you're not go and you start to like you actually like pick up these things and you're aware of where zones can end, you really wouldn't have probably noticed that that change would have taken place. Like you said, it wasn't in the patch notes or anything. They just kind of pushed it through, and suddenly you're seeing the zones. And during this split, along with that, going into this split, we had the POI draft creating a lot of like macro implications for teams. But there were also like two other issues that I think were in some way related to that patch that they pushed out. Um, that had pretty large impacts on the zone pools in ALJS. So I'd like to talk a little bit about each of those because I think now that both are resolved now, I still think it's important to understand how to identify types of trends like this because it can provide a lot of value for your team. Like you said, I mean, you guys picked that up, and you were able to apply that at the end of split one and going into split play one playoffs, and it helped you with your macro because you're obviously able to now understand. I would have normally never played, X or Y building or position because I wouldn't have assumed, that this area could be pulled. Now I know that, and maybe that's shared with other teams know that too, but maybe they don't. And suddenly, you have a leg up that you might not have had before in what you're expecting. So one of the first things that happened though, and again, I think might have been related to this patch, and originally, I think Snipedown actually brought it up on like a podcast or something, but he was talking about it, the lava issue on World's Edge, and so during the split, when that fix was put through that changed those things, they had originally. I think the way that this order worked out was they pushed that patch through that changed the invalid zones, and then some zones were ending on the lava. And I remember specifically some zones that were like ending straight on like lava siphon, like in the lava itself. And I guess when they pushed a patch through to fix that, they ended up making it so that like no end zones could spawn within a radius of any lava on World's Edge. And so it resulted in like all of Thermal Station, Lava Siphon, Climatizer, Lava Fissure, the area between Monument and Fragment, all these other spots that you couldn't get in end zone. And this seemed to be a trend that like some teams took notice of. And once they did, how do you think that it impacted the way that teams played or even drafted their POIs? Or do you think it even impacted it at all?
I think I don't really think that would have impacted a POI draft all that much. I think it was just, yeah, a mistake. From memory, it was they didn't know how to combat it initially when they saw the first zone pull into the lava. So the, I guess, band-aid solution was to just, you know, make any zone within a certain radius of um, any lava on World's Edge completely invalid. Which yeah, I don't think changes too much. If anything, maybe it makes tree a little less desirable.
Right.
Just because there's a few POIs, like thermal. Launch site has lava. In between launch site and dome, there's lava. In dome, there's lava. Um, obviously siphon as well. So there's kind of like a fair few surrounding POIs that have lava in them. But that would be all I'd say.
Right. I think like yeah, I guess maybe it has a little bit more impact on like your macro more than anything because like obviously if like a ring is over your POI draft because like obviously if you're in Mirage Voyage or something and you see that it's pulling siphon tree harvest siphon tree thermal, it's pretty likely it's gonna end like tree and not the other two versus like out in the northeast, it's not going to pull dead center on climatizers. So you can kind of play around that. Did you guys, do anything for your macro specifically to adjust or account for those changes, or was that something you guys discussed during the split at all?
Um, yes and no. So it wouldn't necessarily affect. For the most part, it wouldn't affect our macro unless it was, you know, came down to where we thought zone was pulling, or yeah, like an estimate on the final ring. Um, and yeah, if anything, it would just affect where we played from. So if we saw I guess a seemingly unpredictable zone 2 hovering in between thermal or tree, we were more likely to assume that it was pulling back to tree just
Right.
because the majority of thermal zones didn't exist anymore. We pretty much deduced that the only way it was pulling into thermal was if it was pulling to like those 4 yellow buildings southwest of the lava.
Oh, I see.
And
Okay.
if we couldn't see it pulling there, then we assumed it was pulling back to tree.
Okay. And because I think that's like, yeah, that's definitely something that, obviously if you're playing in like in ranked or, challenger circuit, I think a lot of teams aren't really thinking of those sort of things. And obviously like in pro league, knowing those things, like and going into the next topic here in a second, but like obviously, knowing that if you see, siphon, thermal and Treant, and you can expect that a lot more teams are going to have a correct zone prediction than in the past, where it could counter pull, and a lot of teams might be playing a position that was just not optimal for them. Now you have a little bit more honed in idea of where things could pull. But the other one that I think is a lot more prominent this split, and I think we definitely saw a lot more people acting on, even and we saw the influence in the POI draft, in the overall results of the game. I don't know if you're aware, like I work on the POI draft stats. So I've been doing, a compilation of all of those statistics. And one big thing that we've seen is this bias towards the two northern POIs on World's Edge, Skyhook and Overlook, and then the southern bias of End Zones and Storm Point, Barometer, Echo HQ, and Devastated Coast. And and for this, I think the results are pretty clear that like the teams were very clearly responding to this trend. They were picking POIs that were just closer to these areas. It's why Survey Camp, obviously Survey Camp started to see a little bit of a jump up for that reason. There's other reasons as well, but being having the proximity to those two end zones. But in regard to the POI draft, as well as like the macro in the game, was this something that actively factored into your guys' game plans? Did you account for this when you were drafting? Did it change the way you were rotating, or anything like that?
Yeah, 100%. So it in some areas it affected how we draft. In some areas it affected how we'd rotate, what we'd prio, the way we wanted to play zones. So I think on Storm Point it fluctuated a lot more. It wasn't as stagnant as it was on World's Edge. So World's Edge, it genuinely felt like every zone was pulling somewhere between Skyhook and Overlook for what felt like 75% of games.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think it was Losers 2 at Split 1 just past, where we saw two zones that pulled even further west of trials, and then one that pulled just east, so it was still a Sky West zone. So genuinely 3 end zones.
Yep.
Um, in 3 possible games
Yeah, because I think that
that
was
pulled
Alliance
within
was playing there, right?
150. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that pulled within 150 meters of each other. And yeah, then we kind of get to Pro League as well. And again, I remember watching an APAC South day where all 3 zones pulled into Overlook.
Yep.
I think in the first 2 match days in NA, we had 4 Skyhook zones. So it was very obvious that there was a bias surrounding Overlook and Skyhook. And then as for Storm Point, early last split, the zones would pull Coastal, Pylon, Devastated, Launchpad, or Echo.
Almost
Almost,
always.
yeah, genuinely felt like at least 50% of games were pulling to that bottom right quadrant of the map. And then the start of this split, it's felt like we've had so many zones and unimaginable amount of zones that are pulled in between Stormcatcher and Old Thunderwatch, just on that hill, which are terrible zones, by the way.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, a whole lot of North Pad zones.
Yes. Yes. And I can't imagine like obviously I can't imagine that it's too healthy for like the draft system, which is that's a new system, that's this split, and people obviously have mixed opinions on it, but it can't be super helpful when it's pretty easy to narrow down where end zones are going to be, and you can kind of just be like it goes from like, well, these POIs are good because they have better rotations or better loot or something, to now it's, well, these ones are good because this is where the zone always ends, and it's just playing the odds there. I mean, do you think it's better in this situation with how it's been? Obviously, in split one, you guys could pick your POIs, and so having Echo HQ and fighting for that, and fighting off Liquid was a huge benefit for you guys, and you were rewarded for that with those zones. But with the POI draft now, are you just going? Is it? Do you think it's genuinely with how it was? And obviously, we haven't seen a ton of it play out with the new patch, but do you think that it was just better to play exactly in Skyhook? Do you think it was better to play right outside so you have the flexibility? Like, where do you think was the priority? Because obviously we saw Sky West. I think even right now it's sitting at like, it was picked on average like 2.2 turns into the draft. But like, do you think it's better to pick those POIs where you think it's going to end, or would you rather be close so that you can still get more loot? What's the priority there, do you think?
Yeah. So I think it depends on what kind of team you are. If you're a team that isn't too confident in holding a lot of space, and you'd prefer to play a character like Watson, and sit in the best building for zone prio, then you'd probably want to pick a POI like Survey, Epi, or Monument. Even Harvester is always good for that kind of stuff. You've got great prio to the northeast side of the map, but also if there's ever a south zone, you've got fantastic prio to that as well. For teams like ours, SSG, a lot of the top tier NA teams, or teams that are just confident in their team fighting, Climatizer and Skywest just became the 2 most desirable POIs you could possibly have.
Right.
Even a POI like Sky East became very desirable because you see a zone hovering over the north side of the map. You don't even need zone 2 info. You just get yourselves to blue armor, and then just slowly gravitate towards where everybody else is, and you've probably got yourself a good spot in the zone. So yeah, we did get to a point during the split where Overlook started, getting picked very high up in the draft, and it was we even took some stats, or Chrono took some stats about scrim performances from certain POIs, and Overlook was one of the highest, just because 2 out of 3 World's Edge games every day, the zone was pulling to Overlook, or maybe Fragment, or maybe Epicenter.
Yeah, and I mean these are trends that I think specifically they can make end zones super predictable. But they're obviously unintended, and as a result they're based, what you're actually getting is based on personally recorded data. It's pretty anecdotal. There's anecdotal experience because no one in EA is publicly getting these stats out to people. It's not in the patch notes that, hey, Overlook's going to get 60% of zones or Skyx going to get the rest of them. But do you think it's valuable for people in Challenger Circuit and in even ranked maybe to look at these trends, to be aware of these trends? And if not, like what would you say are the important things to learn and look for to becoming better at reading end zones?
End zones as a whole, I've always found is kind of just like there's no one particular algorithm that's just going to help you predict any end zone. A lot of it is just time, just the amount of time and pure volume that you've put into um reading zones, how many zones you've seen, how I guess closely you've paid attention to each zone. So it's for me, it's if the only I guess little formula I've got is that if zone one and zone two are touching, then it's likely to keep pulling towards where it's touching.
Right.
If zone two is not touching the edge of zone one, then it's likely to pull away. Um, but then yeah, but besides that, it really is you just have to look for small details on the map. So like if it's a skyhook zone, is the zone touching above the train station? Is zone one is all of this building in zone one, or is only 2/3 of it in? It's very minute, very small details that you need to pay close attention to, and that is kind of why it just comes down to attention to detail and yeah, the amount of time and the amount of zones that you've seen play out.
Yeah, I think that's also where invalid zones come back into the discussion because this is something that I've always said. I really hate the POI checkpoint in terms of not in terms of landing there, but in terms of just its role in the game. And because when a ring pulls on checkpoint, it's one of the only POIs that like it could be entirely in the zone, and the likelihood of it pulling there is still just like monumentally low. I mean, it's almost always going to pull out to down beast or to North Pad. It very rarely I've thought or tried in I guess as well. It very rarely pulls within the POI itself. I feel like, and I think the biggest factor there is looking at the invalid zones. I mean, obviously North checkpoint, you have the upper and the lower, so you can't have a heal off, so it's very unlikely it'll pull there. And then the rest of it's these massive mountains, and it makes it very hard um for the end zone to be able to pull into the spots. It can really only pull most of like south checkpoint. There's like one or two zones that can pull like right below the zip line from north to the little building, but for the most part it really can't pull to a lot of places in that POI, so you won't see as many of them. And like you said, just being aware of like the little details, being aware, well, like I know this all areas out because it can't pull here because of these invalid zones. um I think it makes it even more important to play flexibly, and especially now, like I think with all of these different changes that have been introduced, we've seen a lot more counter pulls since that discussion with the invalid zone changes. And I've noticed a lot more unpredictability. So how much do you factor in um, God spot into your macro? Because I think in the past, you'd play out of this, like you would zones used to be so predictable that you could be like, this is almost guaranteed the best spot in the game. I'm just going to get here and it's going to give me the best chance of success. But now it's like we'll see people that are playing what they think is a God spot. We'll get a counter pull more often than not, and then suddenly they've lost that advantage. Whereas playing someone that's playing a little more flexibly can change that. Do you think that there's one strategy that's better than the other, playing for a more flexible position versus playing for a God spot?
Um, yeah. So we will 9 times out of 10 opt to play for a spot with a lot more versatility. Zones, as much as I said earlier, it's about time put into it. There are a lot of people that have put countless hours into just watching VODs, watching scrims, watching LGS, and I've seen almost every zone there is to see. But some look so similar and are so hard to distinguish between that you still are going to get it wrong. It'll be what feels like an unpredictable zone pool, and you've gone from playing the spot that you were almost certain is going to be in the final zone. You've got what what you can only imagine is going to be a top 3 game to now you've got to try and rotate through 11 other teams to get to the zone that's pulled to the other side of the map. So yeah, I would definitely, unless you are near certain of the final zone, I would always opt to play a more versatile spot. Whether that's a spot that's like maybe a little more isolated than a big cluster of buildings and having to try and manage your way out of an 8-team pile up if it pulls away.
Yeah.
Or if it's a spot with elevation. But yeah, I would definitely say both work. But you'd want to be almost certain of the zone if you're going to play a like a one-dimensional spot with that lacks versatility.
Right. So I guess it comes down to kind of like gambling versus simplicity or consistency, right? Like kind of which
Yeah,
um
pretty much.
style you want to take on. So the last thing kind of going into the ring guessing before we talk a little bit about Moist is the most recent changes that just happened that affect the way that the zones will pull moving forward. Obviously, to address these concerns, they've touched a little bit, if I'm not mistaken, on fixing the lava issues. So that's good, but they also push forward a change to hopefully trim down the ability to consistently pull back to back skyhook overlook zones, making the quadrants. And basically, the gist of that is that they've put an XY axis on the map and basically said there's a 25% chance of every map at every game it's going to pull to one of each of these quadrants, and then the zones will be randomized from there. Do you think that's a good change? And do you fundamentally think it, or do you think it fundamentally fixes the problem with bias that we've seen in end zones?
Well, yeah, I think on paper it definitely does, but I don't know. It's a tricky one. Um, if that works, then yes. If it is genuinely, each zone pulls to or has an equal chance to pull to each quadrant of the map, then yeah, sure. But it's also a BR, so that is pretty much as fair or as non RNG as you can possibly make. A ring pulling algorithm without without implementing something that looks like if it pulls to this quadrant, it can't possibly pull there again.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. It's felt a lot better the last few days since the patch.
That's good.
Still have seen a fair few zones repeat. So I think yesterday in scrims there were 2 zones that pulled very close to one another, and then the last one was a down beast zone, and then scrims today was a very identical looking down beast zone to the one yesterday. So it's still you know game to game it's got a 25% chance to pull to each quadrant of the map. But if it's going, say for Storm Point for example, if every time it pulls to the top left side of the map, it's going to pull to down beast, it's still not fantastic. It's still
Right.
going to mean that POI draft is going to get skewed. Teams are going to be more willing to opt for mill down beast, more so than they already do. So yeah, it is. Yeah, like I said, it's a step in the right direction. They just need to make sure that doesn't start happening, because I think 3 days in a row I've seen a down beast zone now.
Yeah, that was kind of the question I was going to have, because I'm like, if every 25% of the time that it pulls to the northeast of World's Edge, it pulls to Overlook, and every 25% of the time that it pulls to northwest, it pulls to Skyhook, then 50% of the time it's still the same end zones, so relatively isn't fixing the primary problem of these repeating end zones. And so I definitely agree with what you're saying, that it's like, in theory, it's the closer you can get. And there's kind of something else maybe though that they need to tweak a little bit. Well, again, like you said, they might have fixed it, but it's hard to say with a small sample size. Maybe over time we will um, see that it is good, and or maybe we will see, like you said, that this down beast is now a new issue that we're seeing or something. How do you think that this change, I think if we go under the assumption that this has fixed this situation, and now we can expect a quarter of the time it's going to pull to each of these four quadrants of the map, do you think that there are POIs that were very strong before because of the old way that are now significantly less viable? And do you think there's a vice versa to that? Like an example I thought is uh, like Wall, for example, was not getting a crazy amount of prio. I mean, it was getting, I guess it was getting, in a way, it was getting prio to like the North Pad occasionally, and it was getting kind of prio to the Stormcatcher Thunderwatch kind of thing. But um, if the quadrants come in, now it gets the high ground benefit as well. Do you think that there are POIs that have fallen off? There's POIs that are, maybe on the rise?
Um, Naturally, I think yes. So I think Stormcatcher became a very desirable POI for a brief moment in time, just because we kept seeing the zones that pulled just outside Stormcatcher.
Right.
Um, but if I go back to the start of last split, I would say a POI like Coastal, which is just next to Echo on that bottom right side of Storm Point, is a POI with not a fantastic amount of loot. It's your macro options from Coastal aren't fantastic because you've got Pylon right in front of you, Barrow just to your west, which are two very slow POIs. Teams are going to be there for a while, so you don't have a lot of options in terms of rotating quickly. You kind of have to stick to a very specific path. But that doesn't matter if all the zones are pulling to the bottom right side of the map. So as soon as we start seeing that versatility and zones start pulling to North Pad and start pulling to Wall and out to Down Beast, um, though POIs like that become a lot less desirable. And then as far as World's Edge goes, I think, um, yeah, it's POIs like Overlook, it's POIs like Countdown became a very hot commodity at the start of this split because I think the first two or three teams that went there had top 5 days because they had 3 zones that they had to move an average of 400 meters for throughout the day.
Yeah.
But then, I think that POI's weaknesses will start to be exploited as soon as zones start pulling to the opposite side of the map because all of a sudden you're playing with, maybe high tier loot, but not much of it. With no players scanning your POI and a lot of your macro depends on what the teams around you do.
Yeah. And I think what you said about Coastal Camp is really important as well, because one of the biggest downsides of a place like Coastal Camp is it's a POI that gets bullied very easily, and because of, like you said, it has some powerful neighbors, and it's similar to a dome in a way where it's like you land there, you almost always have to be looking over your shoulder for teams walking up on you, because if the ring doesn't pull to where you are, this is a perfect chance for a edge team that has better loot to get 3 KP, to get the ball rolling, get their evo charged up, and that was the biggest downside, in my opinion, of playing out of a POI like that. But you never got to see that downside when you just had to walk. The teams that would bully you are afraid to take that fight because they want to sit in the best spot. Why would they ever fight you when they can secure the best position in an end zone because it's right there? And on the other end, you get the same benefit, because sure, you don't get as good of loot, but you get to loot very quickly and you get to that spot because the zone always pulls there. And I think Survey being split from Epicenter has had that same benefit for a while. Like you said, Overlook has had that benefit. Um, Potentially even like Geyser to some extent, Fragment to some extent. But I do think I agree with you that this is something that we're going to see some of these POIs that were a little bit, not as valuable, are definitely gonna fall. Are we now kind of going into this? You already alluded to one, talking specifically about the down beast zones, but one trend that I was worried about was, and this is just one example, but do you think we're seeing any new trends within these first few days that are arising with the way that these zones are playing out? The one that I was like worried about, and I'm not sure what statistical validity to this is, but with the 25% in each quadrant, would we see more clustering of zones close to those axes? I don't know if that's something, maybe a stats person could tell me how that would work, but um, I don't know. Like, that was one suspicion I had. But is there any trends that we have started to see with the way that zones are pulling? I mean, that you'd be comfortable giving, because obviously you don't want to give away any trade secrets if you know something. But
No, to be honest with you, I've still been seeing a lot of the same zones that I saw prior to this change being implemented. So it's like what I mentioned earlier, where like as much as in theory, uh, each quadrant of the map having a 25% chance, for the zone to finish there, looks good and sounds good and should work. If every time it pulls to the northeast side, it's still pulling to Overlook, it doesn't really matter. Overlook is still a very desirable POI, and then if you land somewhere like Survey, where you've got immediate prio to a zone that finishes in Overlook, but if it pulls back to Skyhook East, you've got great prio there as well. Like those sort of changes won't happen. And of late, yeah, we have. I have still seen, um, like just today there was a zone that pulled, just north of Overlook around that rocky open space area, which is where a lot of them have been pulling. Um, but just yesterday we saw a mirage zone that we haven't seen much of recently. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's working in some areas, it's not in others.
Okay. And so now that we've dove into this these trends and the way you can use trends to identify end zones, what would you say are the best ways that people that are looking to improve in their zone guessing can practice? I mean, I think you alluded to it as just like repetition, right? Like just getting in there and playing the game. But I've brought up ring guesser before on Apex Legends status, which is also cool because you can actually see which games it comes from and stuff. It's a really is that the best way or is there a better way um, that you would recommend to getting better at just figuring out where these zones are pulling and maybe getting an idea of where it doesn't pull?
Um, I think it's hard to find a balance in Apex just because recency bias plays such a big part in zones. They do release, with some patches, entirely new zone sets. So zones that you've seen, you know, a multitude of times, in the last month just disappear and you won't see them any ever again. And then all of a sudden, zones that you haven't seen for months just start popping up again. Um, but yeah, I guess as long as you're within the same patch, recency bias in a lot of instances really works. So if you play versatile spots for those zones, it's going to work. But in terms of getting better at reading zones, I would say watching VODs, watching ALGS, watching competitive Apex, generally, and then just making sure you're actually paying attention to zones. So something that's like I think really good for pro players, coaches, anybody involved in competitive Apex is every time you see the second zone pop up, take a guess yourself. So have a close look at zone 1 and 2 and try and guess where it's going to pull. Um, because then next time you see that zone, you're going to be like, oh, this is the one that I thought was going to pull over at this spot, but it didn't. It actually pulled here.
Right.
Um, and then yeah, I guess subconsciously you kind of like imprinted in your brain.
Right. And so I guess like, for repetition, like you said, recency bias. So like getting the most recent data is definitely um, can be super helpful, especially with new data sets be coming out with patches that are maybe like shadow patches we're not necessarily aware of for the new zones. And also, like you said, like, and like Ring Guesser can help a lot. There's also on Apex Legends status, I always want to plug them. They do have an interactive map that you can actually show where invalid zones are to kind of help understand where they are. I'm not, I'd have to reach out to Hugo to see how often they're updated. I'd imagine they're pretty recent. And you can also check on ALGS on there to see where all the zones have pulled in ALGS across all the regions. Super helpful tool. But I think that's super helpful. I really appreciate that. What would you change, just kind of to round it out? Is there anything that you would change to the way that invalid zones or even just end zones in general are determined?
Um, I would revert the changes they made to invalid zones because I think getting rid of zones that lack competitiveness is good for the game. I think making sure I think any zone that kind of has like one or two spots where it's just like you're gonna have a great game. There's not really much anybody can do about it. Um, need to go. I think zones. I think they need to take a closer look at map design and map layout And I'm not saying change the way the map looks accordingly. I'm just saying zones like, the zone that pulls in between Stormcatcher and Old Thunderwatch, zones like that need to go. There's not a lot of playable space. They're relatively shit zones.
Right.
Uh, the zones that pull north of Wall out around the nuts, and then the one that pulls up to that platform. Any zone where it's like, on a steep incline is often very hard to play if you're coming from, the lower side of the map. If you're not already up on that high ground, it's a very difficult zone to play.
Right.
Um, and I guess maybe looking at making those invalid zones as well.
Okay. And so I appreciate that. Before we close out here, I want to talk a second about Moist, or not Moist rather, or I don't really know the full. To be completely honest with you, I don't know the full situation on that, but we could shelf that for an offline discussion. But obviously, you've not had the split you guys have wanted so far. But now you've made big roster changes. You've picked up Timmy. Now you have Waltzy as your IGL for his first time, I believe. Has that change met your expectations so far? And what changes have you made following this new roster that you expect to carry into the next few lands? Because, I mean, obviously, even if you don't qualify for Split 2 playoffs, you have EWC, you have Champs to look forward to, which you're already, I believe, qualified for both. Yeah, have you met, have they, to summarize that, have they met your expectation, this new roster change? And what changes are you planning to make with that roster?
Yeah. So picking up Timmy, we kind of, when MT decided that he didn't want to, or that he needed to take a step away for a little bit, wanted to return to Australia. I think our options were, you know, maybe an an IGL or a more established IGL that might be, an immediate fix and will be really good for the short term, or do we pick up a player like Timmy, who we think we can mold into, the exact player that we want? Um, and then, an option like that is obviously a more long term uh option, and then it was kind of just like, deliberating about which of the two we thought was going to be more beneficial. Do we want that short term success, or do we want to play the long game and potentially miss out on split two, but come champs we're going to be, a much better team than we could have been had we have picked up the safer option. And that's pretty much what we did with Timmy. We kind of played the risky game. We knew that we were going to experience some hardships early on. We knew it wasn't going to be smooth sailing. Um, we've basically we're turning our co-IGL into a complete IGL, or trying to turn him into a complete IGL, whilst picking up an IGL of a different team that plays a completely different way to us. So it's like,
Right.
those two are still trying to figure out their dynamic, whilst he's still trying to, put together his kind of IGLing portfolio and figure out exactly how he wants to play the game. And yeah, we kind of, to an extent, start from ground zero, because, everything that we'd already learned about Empty and the way that he wants to play the game, we have to, wipe from our memories and start again with Waltzy. Albeit, obviously, Waltzy's going to take a lot of what he's learnt from Empty and implement it into his own IGLing style.
Right.
But yeah, there was always going to be, a rocky road to begin with, whilst we iron out, the team's dynamic, figure out, who suits what legends, whilst the meta is also, ever evolving. Um, and then yeah, I guess turn Waltzy into a more assertive version of himself that can, go from taking over in moments where he sees fit to having to take over the entire games and kind of be that voice of, that established voice of leadership from the get go.
Yeah, I think that um I think obviously losing MT, massive loss. Hate to see him go. I'm glad that he's going to be, achieving something like going back home. I'm sure he's excited to be back with like family and stuff like that. Um, I think Timmy, on the other note, though, was a fantastic pickup for the roster. I think you guys are going to see crazy success with that roster in the future. I have to ask this because um, I think on the Apex pod they had Waltzy on, or they've had Waltzy on. I don't know if they asked him this, but I know that they asked Verhulst a similar question. They had something, was at any point strafing flame on the menu for the, was that ever discussed about bringing strafing flame over to NA? Because I know he's talked about it.
Yeah, no, we definitely spoke to Strafing. It was again one of those. He's obviously a fantastic player and a fantastic IGL. He plays very differently to the way we play, so there would have been
Right.
a massive element of, even though he knows exactly the way he wants to play, even me, I would need to change the way I coach and view the game to suit his, because it's a lot easier for the coach to kind of mold their coaching around the IGL than it is for the IGL to do the same.
Right.
Um, and then Guild and Waltzy need to do the same thing, learn to play around a player like Strafing. Um, so, as much as it would have been a better short-term option, and he's a fantastic player, we still would have had our issues. And then obviously, looking past that and looking outside of Apex, logistically,
Yeah.
that's an absolute nightmare
Yeah.
trying to get him here in
Yeah.
such little time.
Yeah, I think definitely logistics alone, it would have been a monumental feat. But also, aside from that, I think the choice to pick up Timmy was a smart one. I think it's one that's going to pay off in troves as you guys work together and build up that chemistry. And I think this is going to be one of those roster changes that people look back on as like a massive step in the right direction in your story. So I really appreciate you coming on and make the time for this. I think we had a great discussion. Hopefully, something that people at home can take away something and be able to improve in their personal game. But before we head out, I just want to know, is where can people find you? Is there any type of content that you're working on individually that you would like to, talk about at this moment?
Uh, yeah, pretty much just Twitch. I've started my stream back up. I got a bit lazy for a moment of time there, but
I think you have a reason.
yeah,
I think it's, it's okay. I
yeah,
think under the
yeah. I kind of stepped
circumstances.
away for a little bit, but yeah, I'm on Twitch at
Okay.
the moment and looking to get into YouTube content soon.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'll link all that in the description, so anyone looking to find you will be able to do that. So yeah, again, I thank you. Really appreciate your time coming on. And for everyone watching at home, if you guys want to follow Draugr on Twitter and on Twitch, I'll have that linked. If you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at BurkTheNerd and twitch.tv/BurkTheNerd, also linked down below. Make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already, and comment if there's any specific topics you'd like me to cover in the next, because I'm always open to suggestions. So with that, Draugr, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.